Europe, a report from Europe that has all three elements of the toxic agenda. So this is really what they're promoting through the Samoa Agreement. Again, abortion on demand, comprehensive sexuality education, and sexual orientation and gender identity. Here is a specific provision that advances comprehensive sexual and reproductive health information and education, which is the same term as comprehensive sexual education. They just changed it because of the opposition to these comprehensive sexuality education programs. So they changed the term a little bit. And the charter currently includes this language. This language refers to the UNESCO guidelines or guidance on sexuality education to define what this term means. That's how we know it's also comprehensive sexuality education, because those guidelines Sharon went over, and they're horrible. The Parliament itself has issued a regulation that talks about the sexual and reproductive health services that need to be available in Europe. And so they are bound in Europe to provide these services. So of course they're going to export them to other countries in international or regional agreements. Here is a provision saying that the parties to the agreement would have to also promote sexual orientation and gender identity. It doesn't say that, it says you can't discriminate on the basis of the typical terms of religion, ethnic or social origin, or political or any other opinion, or other status. It's very clever because it knows that you would have rejected this provision. But other status under UN speak means SOGI, sexual orientation and gender identity, as interpreted by a committee on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Treaty. So this comment at the bottom, comment 20, interpreted the same language in a UN treaty, referring to other status as not being able to discriminate based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And so how does that go back into the regional treaty? Because the regional treaty commits the parties to cooperate with human rights bodies and mechanisms. Basically what's going on here, I know this is a lot of legal speak, is that the UN, the European Union and others have not gotten everything they want. And so what they've tried to do is tie it into a regional agreement that then relies on UN pronouncements, not General Assembly pronouncements, but UN pronouncements by UN agencies and experts who are radical, pushing radical sexual ideologies, for interpretations of these key terms in a regional agreement. It's very clever. And heads of states don't understand all this. They don't have time to study it. Here is another evidence of how the European Union Commission interprets discrimination on other status, right? It prevents discrimination based on sexual orientation. And this is in their charter. They have to abide by this. So of course they're going to seek the same interpretation in regional and international agreements. And here, this is interesting. This is on the Commission's website, European Commission's website. This is calling on the Joint Parliamentary Assembly. So this agreement is so big and so massive, it tied in parliamentarians to make it look like it was trying to be open to input from legislators like you. It calls on the JPA, the Joint Parliamentary Assembly, of this agreement to not only engage in non-negotiable human rights clauses, but to include sexual orientation and gender identity in those clauses. This is very, very bold. And the Deputy Speaker for the Ugandan Parliament pushed back and said, that's never going to happen. Never going to happen. We're never going to let that happen. Well, that is very admirable. The problem is this is not a formal reservation. This is a statement he made in a meeting. As somebody said yesterday, it's just talk, even though it's necessary talk. Absolutely necessary, absolutely admirable. But what really needs to happen is a formal reservation that says that this discrimination clause in the agreement will never include sexual orientation and gender identity. And there were many others who pushed back, not just on substance, many other parliamentarians, not just on substance, but on process. They demanded to have a copy of the treaty. And it took them forever. It took them, I think, a whole year to get a copy so they could even review it. It's not something that the charter would correct. It says any international or regional agreement needs to be reviewed by the representatives of the people long before it is signed. That's an essential point of the draft charter that you're reviewing. So, again, the Samoa Agreement protects human rights defenders acting at national, regional, and continental levels. Who are they? They're largely funded by the European Commission. And of course, they're going to push sexual orientation, gender identity, CSC, and abortion. How do we know this? Because it's on their website. It talks about who these human rights defenders are and what they will do. And you can see here, they will advance human rights of LGBTIQI persons through funding. And here's another provision on their own website. More than 1,500 different LGBTIQ plus rights defenders and 95 grassroots are being funded by the Commission to push this worldwide. Here is another pamphlet. The European Commission logo is on it, and it says the same thing. And then here are some human rights defenders in Nigeria that are being funded by the EU. And they push the same toxic trio agenda, and there's many others that could be shown to you. If you have any doubts about what the Samoa Agreement stands for, get a hold of the African Bar Association brief. It outlines everything we have talked about and more in terms of the dangers of this treaty. It is a very good brief that will tell you, from a legal perspective, the problems of this agreement. It also undermines national sovereignty, something that's addressed in the draft charter you're reviewing. It does it because it has a bad process. You weren't given full review of the agreement. The agreement labels human rights as essential, which means it's hard to make reservations, general reservations, very limited ability to do so. And if you violate the agreement, the other party, the Commission, can take immediate action without consultation. Also, under the agreement, the participants have to support the work of the Human Rights Council, which we know at the UN, we know is not very good. And ACP states have to take common positions with the EU. See this provision here, Article 80. The parties shall cooperate with the human rights bodies and mechanisms and fully support the work of that council. So imagine the European Commission not getting what it wants at the UN level, then going to a regional agreement and saying anybody who signs up to it has to take common positions with us at the UN. You can see what's going on here. And here's another one, Article 79.1, that says basically the same thing. The parties have to work together to adopt joint resolutions in international fora. I'm a little bit over time, so I'm going to go very quickly and skip some of these slides. One of the deceptive strategies in these agreements is what we call the secondary document strategy. They don't want to put in the bad stuff, the cockroaches, and make them too visible right in the agreement itself. So they refer to other documents that have the cockroaches in them because they know that you won't review those documents. Even if you had the main agreement, which took forever to get, you won't review a document that's referred to in some oblique reference. I'm a lawyer and I won't even read it, right? So here's an example of this. The parties commit to the full and effective implementation of the Beijing Declaration and ICPD, the conference documents. Those are not horrible documents because they were heavily negotiated. But then it says, and the outcomes of their review conferences. They've had these review conferences in very faraway places in the world where your negotiators at the UN can't attend sometimes, often cannot attend, cannot get to them. And so the outcomes of those conferences have been horrible. Look at this one. This is UNFPA's ICPD plus 20 conference. ICPD is International Conference on Population Development. And look at all these references to the toxic trio agenda that we talked about. And so this is another game that is played that is an abuse of national sovereignty, frankly, an abuse of process because of the way they did it. Here's another one. So the Maputo Protocol Plan of Action is a non-binding document that implements the Maputo Protocol. And it is much worse than the Maputo Protocol. Why? because it was endorsed and negotiated by entities like the IPPF, influenced by IPPF. And so this Samoa agreement would take that Maputo plan of action and make it binding through this treaty. And how do we know that this strategy? Well, IPPF itself on its website boasts that at the end here, IPPAR, that's their African Regional Office, led the advocacy for the creation of the first continental framework for sexual and reproductive health, right? The toxic trio agenda in the Maputo plan of action. That was their whole goal. Okay, Maputo Protocol is not that bad because African negotiators were heavily involved. We're going to develop an implementation document, non-binding, that we have control over. And we're going to redefine some of the terms in the Maputo Protocol to advance sexual and reproductive health and human rights. This is what they do. And so that's why this charter, this draft charter we're talking about, is so important, is to stop those games and stop having terms redefined in ways that you don't have access to. Here's the Maputo Plan of Action. SRHR is all over it, inside of it, right? And just read the red language, right? This is from the Maputo Plan of Action that IPPF and others sponsored and supported. And here's one on reproductive and sexual health and having the ability to decide on those issues. And so here's one on CSE, right? So it's all in it, all three elements of that toxic trio agenda. And then here's an interesting one. African nations should remove legal, regulatory, and policy barriers limiting adolescent and young people's access to SRH. That includes parental rights, it includes religious, and the right to bring up your children in your moral and educate them on moral grounds. It's just, they're trying to undermine all the African culture and family and parental rights, right, through these kind of things. So I'm not going to go over number 2 because Sharon did that very quickly yesterday. Let me just touch on number 3. And this is just to show you how insidious and how and pervasive these threats are. They have infiltrated the regional economic communities. Okay, I'm only going to cover an example from the EAC, but there's other examples too. And there was a bill that was proposed twice that was defeated, fortunately, because of some brave souls that would have legalized abortion, mandated comprehensive sexuality education without parental consent, and pushed sexual orientation and gender identity. And guess who sponsored that bill? Not the African nations that make up the EAC, but it was pushed by WHO, IPAS, IPPF, CRR, which is another NGO that pushes SRHR, and others. So, and here's another example of infiltration, right? Cultural imperialism, infiltration of the Organization of First Ladies. Here is IPPF on its website announcing that Africa's First Ladies commit to advocate for women's sexual reproductive health rights. You know what that means? The First Ladies probably had no idea what that meant, right? Because they were not probably briefed, certainly not by IPPF on what it really means, right? And there are protesters outside saying, you know, this conference undermines women's rights. What we're trying to do is protect women, not undermine their rights, right? And look at the sponsors of the Organization of First Ladies. It's the same usual suspects. IPPF, UNFPA, UNAIDS, UNICEF, there's IPPF right there, if you can see them. It's just the same old stuff. They're everywhere, they operate at every level of government, they use all kinds of games, and that's why you need the charter, right? You have to make a very loud declaration that sets the record straight on what's allowable and what's not on this continent to preserve Africa, its sovereignty, its families, and its values. Thank you.